Come once again to Kwejo Fosu Inspire. Kindly like, leave your comments, and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you've not done so. Today we are continuing with our 8-part series, and this is the third part on political economy of Africa since independence. Today we are looking at a very important topic in Africa political economy, right? Af Africa at independence, with a special attention to the political and economic conditions that was inherited at the moment the colonial rule formally ended. So this lecture is important because if we want to understand Africa's later development problems, then there is a need for us to look at it when we gain independence, or when independence started, or at independence what they were. So we're looking at the developmental problems, we're looking at the political instability, we're looking at the debates around state development, and even the present day questions about governance and underdevelopment. So we must begin at at independence. That is why we are looking at it from that perspective. Going back to the part one where we saw, or we went through political economy, development, underdevelopment, and a snapshot. Remember in part two, we looked at pre-colonial, right? Before the colonizers were coming. The Mansa Muses, how we were trading on all those things. Then the colonial systems, the economic conditions they left, the economic systems they left or they were building around that time. We looked at the political systems they were building. So at independence, we are putting that in context when we come to an independent. At independence, what do we have? What was left behind at independence? So we're trying to have that contrast between Africa now and Africa in an early era of colonial domination. So that visual contrast is important for you because it will enable you to see that independence was not simply a date on a calendar. It was a transition from colonial rule to self-rule, from imperial domination to Africa's sovereignty, from a foreign command to the hope of self-determination. And that is one thing you should ponder over or think about and see from that particular context. So one of the key things I want you to note over here is that this particular whole lecture, which is independence, which is supposed to let you understand that independence did not mean that Africa started from zero, like from a clean slate, which we also got to know more about when we were treating the part two. That the new African state inherited political systems. You have to ponder about it. They inherited political systems. They inherited administrative structures. They inherited boundaries. They inherited economic and development patterns that had largely been designed by the colonial powers. So throughout this particular lecture, I want you to follow one big story, that Africa gained political freedom, but it inherited a weak structures. It inherited external oriented economies. It inherited a difficult state building problems. So that particular tension between freedom and inheritance, between hope and structural weaknesses, is what defines political economy of Africa at independence. Guys, as we're looking at our lecture objectives for today, we want to examine Africa's political conditions at independence, understand early developmental expectations and strategies, analyze the economic structures that were inherited from our colonial rule, And then they link independent conditions to post-independent outcome. And when I say this, it means that we are not telling a simple celebration story that we've gained independent and that was it. We are not only saying that Africa became independent and that was the end of the struggle for Africa. No, we are saying that independence was a major victory, but it was also the beginning of another struggle for Africa. And that was a struggle to govern, to unify, to industrialize, to educate, and to develop under very difficult inherited what conditions. So what I want you to understand is that political freedom had to be turned into functioning institutions, economic planning, and real social transformation. So as we move from slides to slides, keep this particular question in mind, that what exactly did African states inherit? What did African leaders hope to build? And why was the road after independence much harder than many had imagined? Is at the heart of the lecture, Africa at Independence, and it carries two profound images of Sajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere, the teacher they call him. The slide begins with an opening statement or quote that is profound by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And I read and it says, "We face neither east nor west, we face forward." That line captures the spirit of the era of independence. It meant Africa did not want simply to become what? An extraction of one Cold War bloc or the other. This was an era where you find the USSR and then the US having its own tension, trying to have, so Africa did not want to position itself to be another puppet of another master. No, Africa wanted to define its own future, its own path, and its own developmental model. So this particular bulletin point on the slides basically summarizes the whole lecture very well in terms of political and economic conditions, in terms of the political economy of Africa's development, and that of what? That powerful line of higher hopes, big structures, inherited economies. That phrase, which is higher hopes, big structures, inherited economy, must stay with you as we ponder over this particular course, as we do this. That at independence, there was joy, excitement, there was dignity, an enormous expectation. People were expecting a lot. People believed that freedom would bring roads, it will bring schools, it will bring jobs, it will bring factories and prosperity. But the structures beneath the celebrations were often fragile. They were weak. So many institutions were basically weak. There were many artificial borders that were created, many economic dependency on export of raw materials, and many governments government lack trained personnel. Because at that time Africa did not have more than 2,000 graduates in that particular. So these were challenges. Emotionally, independent was a moment of pride, and analytically, it was also a moment of of deep structure difficulties that was ahead. These three people who were at the forefront of independence, and these are a profound statement made by them to give us a better understanding of what they saw, what they taught. These are powerful people who championed Africa's independence, unity, liberation, and dignity. And we want to start with Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. And he says, in effect, that this is a victory for every African, and that the constitution they created should not belong to one tribe or one nation, but to the whole African people. The meaning of this quote is that independence had to rise above ethnic and narrow commercial divisions. Kenyatta was speaking to a very serious challenge on how do we create a shared national or even a pan-African political imagination in a society that was divided by colonial boundaries and internal differences. So Kenyatta's words has shown us that the early leaders understood that independence could fail if politics became trapped in tribal or sectional competition. So this quote is not just about celebration, and it was also a warning. Because it foresaw that freedom must be must be protected by unity and must be a sense of common ownership of the state. Because in some even modern times, in recent times, you find pockets of violence and wars that are based on on tribal differences. Taking the Rwanda genocide out of a tribal issue. This is what Kenyatta, Jomo Kenyatta foresaw, that unity was important to achieve that. So now let's look at Nkrumah's quote and a profound statement. He said, "At long last, the battle has ended." But he quickly added that Ghana's independence is meaningless unless it is linked to the total liberation of the African continent. This is a classic Nkrumah statement. He was never satisfied with the freedom for one country only. He saw Ghana's independence as the beginning of Of a continental mission. Because the meaning of Nkrumah's quote is in twofold. First, that independence was a great national victory. Secondly, that no African country could see itself as truly free, while other African people remain under colonial rule, settler rule, racial domination. No. That is why Nkrumah became a powerful Pan-Africanist and was one of the leading figures of Pan-Africanism. Because he believed that political liberation had to be continental, not merely national. Because when it's continental, that means he foresaw that when we are able to engage in negotiations, we'll have stronger bargaining powers on the global stage. That's what he foresaw that others didn't see. Then we come to the last statement here by Patrick Lumumba of DRC Congo. So Lumumba, who is a freedom fighter, at independence, and then he made a profound. So in that particular speech, where he congratulated and thanked the Congolese independence freedom fighters, and he told them that this date this day will remain forever engraved in their hearts and the hearts of future generations. The meaning here is dignity through sacrifice. Lumumba's words were deeply emotional because Congo's independence came after a brutal colonial experience under Belgium. Because Lumumba was saying that independence is not a gift; it is a historical achievement purchased through struggle, courage, humiliation, and resistance. Because his quote is about Is about memory. It's about the collective struggle of the people of Congo and about refusing to let colonial domination define Africa's humanity. So when you put these three codes together, it gives us what? The three parts philosophy of independence. Kenyatta gives us what? Unity. Nkrumah gives us what? Continental liberation. And Lumumba gives us what? Dignity and sacrifice. Together, it tells a story that Africa's independence was political, emotional, and moral at the same time. Now we move to political conditions of independence. And this particular map on my left shows that different African countries who had their independence at different times, and makes us understand that independence was not a single day event for Africa. And also it shows a key over here that shows countries that colonized some of these African countries before we were gaining independence. And as I said, independence came in waves, especially from the late 50s into the 70s, where Ghana was fortunate to be the first country in Sub-Saharan Africa in 1957, standing out and getting its independence within that era. And some four key important major points I'd want to highlight in this particular slide will be the independent wave, the end of former colonial rule, higher optimism and nationalist enthusiasm, and the entrance of African states into the international system. So, African countries were not just changing internal governments, they were entering into world politics as a sovereign state. So, what over here is that they joined international organizations, they built diplomatic services, they wrote constitutions, and they began to assert they began to assert their voice globally. But here again, we must connect this to the larger story that formal colonial rule ended, yes, but many colonial political habits and structures survived. So the new African flag did not automatically mean a new political system is sustained or has been subscribed to. It often meant that Africa or Africa's control over institutions that had originally been built for colonial rule, not perpetual development. So even though we've had the independence already, we're more like supervising institutions that had been built by a colonial system, a colonial setup. This slide is one that is important, that gives us as in what kind of state Africa inherited. And you have a sense that Africa inherited what? A weak and fragile institution. Colonial administrative structures were retained, a centralized authority, and a limited experience with democracy or democratic governance. The sense of what we are having over here is that the colonial states were not built primarily to promote democratic citizenship. They were built to control territories. They were built to extract labor and resources from the continent. They were built to maintain order and protect colonial interests. So when independence came, many African leaders basically just took over that machinery that had been built to design for domination and not inclusion. That machinery that was built based on extraction of resource, that's the same thing they came to to preside over. And this is why many post-colonial African states remain centralized, because what they came to super intend over was already structured in a centralized way, where power tend to be gathered around the executive, around the presidency, around the ruling class or the elite, or around the bureaucracy. And in some cases, the defense was that it was necessary for unity and rapid development. But in many cases, some defense was also that it was narrow. Some of the claims against it was that it was narrow minded. It was narrowed in participation, and it had a weakened or weaker accountability system. So the point over here is that if you inherit a coercive and a centralized system, even a well-intended leadership or leader may end up operating through structures that would reproduce domination rather than transformation, because that's the system you came to take over, and that's the same system you are using. So you end up maybe producing the same thing the system has been structuring or doing over the time, even though you may have good intentions. Flows logically from the previous one. If the inherited state was weak and colonial in origin, then how do we build a nation around it? So the slides gives us the core problem, which are the artificial colonial boundaries, ethnicity, religiosity, and regional divisiveness. So, and then the competition for state power. These and more of them were the core problems, including fragile national identity. So, the image you see me put over here shows you the tribal borders of Africa, where you see it in many ways, like different ethnic groups, different people find themselves on the African continent. And you see this map that also shows you when the Berlin Conference was done and Africa was shared among these European powers without cognizance to the tribal differences and the diversity across the African continent. So these Berlin Conference of the 1884 to 1885 is central in this particular slide because it symbolizes the external carving of Africa by European powers. So the boundaries were drawn from an imperial perspective, not from the African social reality. So communities were split across boundaries, and very different people were grouped into small political units. So now the diversity itself is not a problem, but what you realize that many successful states are diverse. The problem was that colonial rule did not build legitimacy, inclusive national institutions in the form to manage that diversity. Instead, it often deepened differences, and they used the idea of divide and rule tactics, where they had a privilege some group of people over others to further advance the vision within the continent. So when independence came, the state became the center of intense competition, where people who felt they've been marginalized, people who felt they were also superior, thought it is our time. All these differences amalgamated around independence. So whoever controlled the state controlled jobs, contracts, prestige, security, institutions, and access to national resources. That is why state power became so contested, because nation building was therefore not automatic. It required a deliberate effort to create common identity, fair inclusion, and a sense that the nation belongs to all, which affirms also or goes to link up to what Jomo Kenyatta said in that what quote I showed you. Important slides in this lecture is the leadership at the center of political independence. We want to see who were the leaders at independence. What was Africa blessed with, or actually got as leaders? So in this particular slide, you see three leaders, and I'll say these were charismatic nationalist leaders, such as the first person you see on my left is Patrick Lumumba. The one in the middle is the great Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and the one on my far right is Julius Nyerere, popularly sometimes called what the teacher. In their dominance of liberation movements, the rise of single party system, and the trade-off between democracy and political stability. But for you to understand this in a proper sense, we must go deeper and talk about the leaders as historical actors, not just names on this particular slide. So let's start with Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. So Kwame Nkrumah was one of the greatest and most influential voices of Africa at independence. He led Ghana to become the first black African colonial south of the Saharan to gain independence from Europeans or from European rule in 1957. And he quickly became a continental symbol of anti-colonial possibility. So he believed in the Pan-Africanist word unity, and he argued that freedom of one African country means little unless the whole continent is free. Nkrumah was not only a nationalist leader, he was also a development thinker. He believed that African states had to lead industrialization, education, infrastructure, and continental cooperation. And he wanted Ghana to become a model of modernization and a base for Africa's liberalization. And at the same time, as the document also suggests, or the literature suggests, that his rule later moved into a challenging time where some may say it may have been authoritarian in nature, and that became more like also a pattern that was seen in some post-colonial states where later these leaders were criticized for their clinging on to onto power. Some may also argue that, as the literature suggests some of these things, these leaders, as Nkrumah, experienced assassination attacks on his life. I mean, I've informed some of the things that happened and or what some of the measures or decisions he took. But all these are also contested, and different views and different opinions as you engage yourself with the literature and make your own view if you think it was far-fetched or it wasn't. So now let's turn to Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. So Nyerere is one of the most respected African leaders because he combined nationalism, humility, moral seriousness, and an educational vision of leadership. So what I can tell you is that he was often called Malimu, which means the teacher. And the name tells a lot about him because he believed that leadership should educate, unite, and morally guide society. So Nyerere importance over here lies in several areas that we're going to look at. He helped lead Tanganyika to independence. Later united Tanganyika, and then Zanzibar to create a Tanzania. right? And promoted what Kiswahili as a unifying language in a what highly diverse society. So you see, Nyerere saw, you see, the statement that was made by Julius was made by Jomo Kenyatta is one that Nyerere saw that indeed to be able to move Tanzania forward, because these were different people at independence, there was a need to unite the country. So a national language is one way it could also help what unite the country. And then he moved in that direction. And he didn't stop there. He advanced that idea of what Ujoma, which is familyhood, a vision of what cooperativeness, rural-centered development, and self-reliance or development. And then he also became a major African statesman, supporting a liberalization movement from the South Africans, and then standing for continental solidarity. So this seeks to emphasize his integrity, modesty, his commitment to institutions, and peaceful transfer of power, which he left office. And when he left office, you could not, he didn't have houses. The house he had was built by the army for him. That shows how modest, profound a leader is. Now, moving to Patrick Lumumba of Congo. His importance is moral and symbolic, and also a tragic story. He represented the demand for true independence, not merely symbolic independence under a continued foreign control. So Congo's independence in 1960, where you found Patrick Lumumba, who spoke with extraordinary courage about the suffering of Congo people, they've endured or they've had under Belgium rule. This is when the then Belgium king spoke and made it look as if it was them giving it to them. It was as out of their own believedness. But he spoke with boldness when Lumumba took the microphone and challenged that narrative in front of him. You could feel that he refused that time. It was a script that was given to him. He refused that polite colonial script that he had to read. No. And he spoke from pain, dignity, and truth. And that is one thing that made him deeply important in African history. He stood for authenticity, or authentic sovereignty, and Africa's dignity. Somebody will say that his boldness also made him enemies. That boldness made him enemies, both internally and externally, and led to his overthrow and his assassination that turned him into um where he was assassinated, later dissolved into acid, and the only thing that was left of him then later we found was a golden tooth that he had. So what I want you to understand by Lumumba is that it is important for you to understand that symbolism, for you to understand the kind of danger facing African leaders who sought genuine independence in the Cold War world that was shaped by foreign interest and domestic instability. But we should not stop there. Other important African leaders also mattered greatly. The likes of Jomo Kenyatta, who symbolized Kenya's path toward independence and nation building. Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, who promoted humanism and peace. Leopold Segar Sandor of Senegal, who also combined culture, intellectualism, and statecraft. And then Ahmed Ben Bali in Nigeria, who emerged out of a very brutal anti-colonial war. And if you want to understand this better, you can also watch our video on Frantz Fanon's perspective in terms of Algeria, and you get that better. And then Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, who symbolized Africa's dignity on the world stage and he played a major role in the foundation of the Organization of African Unity. And you may not want to forget other leaders like Nelson Mandela, who belonged slightly to a later era, which was in relation to an independent wave. But he became one of the greatest symbol of Africa's liberation against racial domination. So what I want you to get from this particular slice is that Africa did not lack leadership at independence. On the contrary, Africa at independence had remarkable leaders. It had remarkable thinkers, remarkable organizers, and had visionary people. The tragedy of this issue is that many of them had to work through weak inherited institution, external pressures, Cold War interferences, and a highly fragile state. That is why leaders became both a source of inspiration and a site of deep contradiction. Discuss having to discuss political leadership, we now shift to inherited economic structures. We've mentioned a lot of inherited. So what were the inherited economic structures that we're talking about in this particular slide? So you see an image that shows you a structure of railway, somebody carrying a cocoa bag to the port. This is basically what we inherited. But it tells us that the colonial economy was built around extraction and export of primary commodity. So agriculture produce, and these agricultural produce were just being shipped out by rail or by through the port, minerals and raw materials. So what this slide is just to confirm that there was a dependency on primary commodity export. That was the structure of the colonial system. The economic condition at independence was that there was a structure of dependency on primary commodity export. There was a limited industrialization. Africa didn't have a lot of industries. And I dare say that maybe the industries that existed that time may not exceed even 20 or even 15. And then a extremely oriented production, like external oriented production, that the economy was focused on external orientation of production, and a narrow tax base, because it had a few people who could be taxed directly. And some of these challenges is what was inherited, or these were the systems that were inherited. I call them challenges because they were ones that actually affected Africa independence. And what you should know that this means that most African economy at independence were not diversified. They were vulnerable because in the sense that if the world prices for cocoa, coffee, copper, granite, or oil drops, the state immediately will feel the pressure. And this created instability in revenue, and it made long-term development difficult because there may be a projection by a country that, for example, Ghana may make a projection that at the end of this year they'll be making $100 million. If there is a price reduction on the world market, and then it affects their revenue collection, and it's now 50 million, it means that there's a gap of 50 million now created. If that money was supposed to go into roads, rural roads, or go into other sectors, it means that those places may still now face challenges because there isn't money to use for those things that was projected. So that was the difficulty. Because colonialism did not create broader industrial economies in Africa. It created what? Exported what? Enclaves, so that they'll be able to export those raw materials for them. Because the production in itself was just offering aimed at outward what? Production. It was toward that foreign market, rather than just an inward or towards a balanced what? National development. And that narrowed tax base meant that government had weak financial capacity, because they wanted to build schools, right? They wanted to build roads, as I said, hospitals. They had to pay civil servants, maybe employ or expand that to provide better service for the people. But many lacked what? That domestic revenue that could help them be at that foundation to sustain the schools or build the schools, take care of civil servants. That was a challenge. So from the word go start, political independence coexisted with what? Economic what? Challenges or fragile systems that were already what? In place economically. This lies deep in the economic story that we are pondering or talking about over here. So what you see a four bulletin point, which is export-led growth model, infrastructure design for extraction, foreign ownership of key sectors, and regional inequalities within countries, are among the most important ideas in Africa, or when it comes to Africa's political economy. So the railway line you see here, and you see here, and a port you're basically seeing with a ship over there also, seeks to capture that logic perfectly. That everything was engineered, infrastructure was engineered to help what? In terms of what? Export orientation. So what you realize that the colonial infrastructure was usually not what? Designed to what? To unite domestic economy or to help promote intercity trade. No, that was not the idea. It was designed to move goods from the interlands straight to the port for export, to the coast for export. And that is why roads and railway were often what? Linked to mining sites, were often linked to plantations, where well and the port, rather than what? The village what? Economy or national markets, or the balanced what? Economic or regional what? Development. So what you realize was that the infrastructure flowed what? Or followed that logic of extraction, not the logic of what? Social welfare of the people. So foreign ownership were also and also taking care taking hold of the key sectors that also matters. Even after independence, the likes of the mining, the plantations, the banks, the shipping trade, and the technical sectors were still under foreign control. That was it. And even the ones that were not even under foreign control were also seriously what? Heavily what? Foreign influenced. So the issue was that the new African state did not fully control the commanding height of its own economy, because the regional what? Inequality was among the most serious colonial what? Inheritance that these leaders inherited what? At independence. And some regions received roads, railway, schools, investment because they were useful to colonial production. That's why you saw all those roads on all those railways over there. And others were neglected because they felt that they didn't have any resources. There was nothing there. So after independence, all those inequalities remained and often fed toward political resentment. So the economies or the economy was not only what underdeveloped, it was also what unevenly structured. This is what was inherited at independence. That colonial legacy that was inherited at independence was this. This tells us that even if leaders had visions, they still needed what? People and institutions to implement those particular visions. So the classroom image you see here is very important. It's just meant to remind us that the struggle after independence was not only about constitution and speeches. It was about teachers, civil servants, planners, engineers, doctors, accountants, and administrators. And the bulletin that you see here mentioned in this slide mentions the low level of education and training, the dependency on expertise, or dependency on personnel who were not indigenous people, who were basically still foreigners or are colonizers. There was weak planning, implementation capacity, and a shortage of skilled labor. So many African countries were not prepared for colonial power, for full self-government, because colonial rule had generally trained Africans for a subordinate role, such as clerks, interpreters, soldiers, junior assistants, but not sufficient number of people for sufficient high level administration. So they did not basically train people in the colony in terms of high level administration, in terms of management, in terms of technical management or advanced planning, or in terms of engineering, having to help with industries. No, they didn't do that. So as a result of this, many new states faced a huge capacity gap. They had flags, all right, they had constitutions, and they had leaders, but not enough trained people to run ministries, design infrastructure, manage budgets, and then teach in universities, or experts in the modern services, or experts in technologies that were available at that particular time. Those people in the colony were not trained to do this. This is why expatriate personnel were often remain important in early years of independence, because we did not have people who were trained experts in the field. And you realize that at independence there were few graduates that were in the colony or that was across the entire African continent. So one of the deepest post-independent problem was that the dream of development required required skilled human labor. It required skilled human base that the colonial rule had not adequately created. Tell you a story from leadership to the economic conditions that were created by the colonial system, to removing to colonial legacies that were inherited, that we had, to looking at the human development where it became a challenge that with the expertise that were not there. Then now we move or transcend into developmental expectations and strategies. That the people at independent people had expectations. People were expecting certain things to happen. So this slide is about development dreams. And the two image over here that you see are important because that's one is from Akosomo Dam in Ghana. The other one is about the Tanzania Tanzam Railway, also known as the Tanzania linking Tanzania and then Zambia. These are not just random infrastructure image that I picked. It was intentional. But they represent the ambition of the post-independent Africa to modernization, or to create that kind of modernized system, an industrialized system, and they will build a self-reliant development path for Africa. So let us begin with our bulletin points for this particular slide. So we make mention of rapid economic growth, infrastructure, industrialization, and modernization, and then social transformation and economic self-reliance. These were the central hopes of many independent governments. These were the desires. These were what these governments were designed for, what they're hoping for, were wishing will happen. So leaders wanted a visible transformation, not just a formal sovereignty, a sovereignty on paper. No, they wanted it to be what that transformation to be visible, to show that we already have sovereignty and able to do greater things for our people. So, what is the Akosomo Dam? The dam is a major hydroelectric dam built on the Volta River in Ghana under Nkrumah's leadership. And its main purpose was to generate electricity to support industries. And it was a symbol of a modern developmental state. And it was one that represented the idea that Africa could use large scale infrastructure to power industries, expand productive capacity, and then transform society. So in this sense, the Akosombo Dam that we see here is not is was more than a dam. It was a national developmental symbol, but it also illustrated the complexity of development, the large infrastructure project that required foreign capital, required technical expertise, because even though the Akosombo Dam was being built, there were certain expertise that at that time at independent Africa didn't have. We didn't have some people who had some of this expertise, so we still had to rely on foreign technical experts in some of these fields. And this massive state uh, coordination is that shows of what the Akosomo Dam signals. So whilst Akosomo Dam symbolize ambition, it also reflects the dependency and the financial strain that often accompanied ambition or post-colonial developmental planning. Now, the Tanzam Railway or the Tanzam Ram, which was a railway project connecting Zambia to the port of Dar es Salaam in um, Tanzania, and then it bordered, and also its broader meaning was political as well as economical. Well, it sought to reduce dependency on routes that were controlled by white minority regimes in southern Africa, and to also promote that regional integration trade that did not existed, because as I said, most of the railway lines and most of those things were led to the port for extraction. So this was more of one that was supposed to boost integration within Africa, within the African continent, and which was quite a strategic idea that was geared towards autonomy. So what you are seeing over here that is about the imagination of independence. That African leaders did not dream small. African leaders at the time of independence did not dream small. They imagined dams, railway, industries, schools, and integrated development. And this project tells us that the early African development was driven by a larger vision of transformation, and not by a passiveness of things. And it gives you that perspective for you to understand that the leaders who were at independence had a vision that transcended beyond time, that transcended and would have stood the test of time, and needed the time for the people to actually come to understand that they needed room to be able to do some of these things. So these are just a few I picked upon for this particular slide. Slide follows directly from the previous one by telling us how leaders try to turn developmental hope into policies. This slide lists this particular four bulletin points over here, which is state-led development, import substitution, industrialization, expansion of the public sector, and then national development plans. The images you see over here as Ghanaian Times news report showing the visit of Osajefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah at the dam site during the period where it was being constructed. And the upper picture over there shows you the Akosombo Dam currently, and a graphic image also of Ujoma, which we'll be talking about when we get to Julius Nyerere, a slice on Julius Nyerere. So, state-led development basically meant that it was the government which was expected to be the engineer or to be at the peak of engineering or change, because the private sector was weak. For it was foreign controlled. They had foreign control, and there were many leaders who believed that the state had to get involved to do a direct investment, create industries, build infrastructure, and guide national policies when it comes to state-led development. Also, when we talk about import substitution, we basically are saying that it means that reducing our dependency on imported manufactured goods by building domestic industries. So the idea was to produce at home what had previously been imported from abroad. So this was part of the broader quest for economic self-reliance. And also, when we talk about expansion of the public service, this followed the natural flow that governments were creating ministries, public corporation, planning bodies, state farms, transport agencies, and development broadly. So this kind of expansion where government was looking at is one thing that was important because it helps focus and then on certain industries or certain part of the economic or development process, where each particular part of those countries will all experience this form of development that is supposed to help make the life of their people easier and then was simple for them. And national development planning emerged because leaders believed that change had to be coordinated. It had to be intentional and long term. So what you're having from this particular slice is that it shows us that African leaders did not simply inherit colonial economies and accept them by saying, okay, this is what we inherited, so we've accepted them. No. So if you have a question, you're asking that what were they doing? If this was what we inherited, did they do anything? This slide seeks to make you understand that they did not just accept them, they made an effort. They actively tried to transform them as independent. Whether they were successful or they succeeded fully is another question for another day. But the ambition and the seriousness was real to make an effort to change what they had actually was inherited from the colonial masters. So we are now moving to country case studies, and the case studies I'm using, these are not the only ones that are available. There are a lot in place that you can actually also acquaint yourself in the literature with. But we basically dealing with just these for now. So these countries where you see images on this particular slide, where you see the Ghana flag, which is red, gold, green, and the black stars, and you see a passionate Osage for Kwame Nkrumah delivering a speech. You see some of the industries that he pushed for the Kumasi shoe factory. You see some industrial pictures of other industries that was opened and that was established by him under his regime. And also you see his idea of also expansion of the port and bringing to the modern era of what was available within that particular dispensation. Ghana is a perfect first case because it stood at the front of the sub-Saharan independent wave and became a continental symbol of hope. So Ghana under Nkrumah embodied optimism. It had a relatively strong economic system compared to many colonies, a large cocoa revenue, some administrative capacity, and a huge symbolic importance as the first black African colony south of the Sahara to gain independence. So industrialization was central to Nkrumah's project. He wanted Ghana not to remain a raw material exporter, but to become a modern industrial state, which has power to which gives power to the next generation, and having that ability of creating that factories, transport system, and educational expansion. This links directly back to what the projects like what Akosombo Dam, because he envisioned that if we are going to do these factories, if you're going to expand transportation and all these things, we will end up needing what energy to be able to what continue this particular what expansion. So he saw that vision for that Akosombo Dam. So it fits into what that vision of industrialization that what he foresaw or he envisioned. State expansion also mattered because the government grew as what it tried to lead what development. It regulated the economy and then drive toward transformation. But this expansion came with a cost. Fiscal pressure in terms of monies that were used for this project that has to be used for all this, administrative what overload, and then later what inefficiency that's occurred in some places, corruption, and what some concerns of authoritativeness, which is arguable by some people also. So Ghana tells a very important story. The first great success of what political liberation in sub-Saharan Africa, but also an early what warning about what the difficulties of transforming independence what dreams into what a sustainable what institution and an inclusive what development. Being a second case study, and this lies on Nigeria. Focus on three key areas or words that are federalism, regionalism, and oil discovery. So the images where you see here, that gives you that of leadership. You see that of Nigeria's border divisions in terms of tribes and other sub-tribes within those particular geographical area, and the flag of the Republic of Nigeria. So Nigeria was and remains one of Africa's largest and most diverse countries, with many ethnic groups and powerful regional identities. So federalism was intended to work to manage that diversity by giving different regions a degree of autonomy within one state. So in theory, that would reduce what conflict. That was the idea of the federalism. The regionalism remained extremely strong, and, politics often became tied to regional and ethnic what composition. And then when it comes to talk about that of oil discovery, which later transformed Nigeria's political economy, where oil generated huge revenue, but it also what intensified the politics of control, rent distribution, and competition over the state. Rather than solving political tension, resource wealth often made the stakes of or political power very high. So Nigeria teaches us that independence in Africa could mean managing not just colonial or inheritance, but also federal bargains, regional tensions, and a complication or a complicated what politics of what of natural resource what wealth. Moving that to of Kenya, where the slides looks at Kenya's in the key point over here is a mixed economy and settler capitalist what legacy. So you see that of Jomo Kenyatta and that of also the coat of arms of Kenya and the flag of what of Kenya. So this a settler's capitalist legacy means that the colonial economy involved a powerful settler presence. So especially in the land ownership system and the commercial agriculture, it was like Africans were often displaced, exploited, or marginalized within the systems. So the question of the land became one of the most explosive what issues in what post independence in Kenya. Because the word or the phrase for the three mixed economy means that Kenya did not go fully in the direction of a socialism or socialist state, or the way they decided to plan, like maybe the how Tanzania did. No, but instead it combined state activities with what? With a significant role of what? Of the market, private capital, and agricultural commercial development. So Kenya is important because it shows how colonial land or colonial land patterns and settler structures could shape the independence era very deeply. So political freedom came, but class, land, and inequality questions what remained. That even though there was political what freedom, the issue of land inequality and what became what a question that lingers on and after what independence or when independence was gained what in Kenya. Looking also at this particular last example or case study, which is Tanzania, it gives us two keywords: socialist orientation and rural development. And you see the picture of Julius Nyerere, and then also that of concepts or ideas of what Ujoma looked like in terms of rural settlement. So we'll be talking about that also. That's what the image depicts or connotes. So under Julius Nyerere, which is Tanzania, who actually wrote out Tanzania's what Ujoma. It often, when we say Ujoma, it often is translated as what familyhood. So Nyerere believed that Africa's socialism had traditions of what cooperation and communal life, and he believed that that communal life could be what mobilized for the what modern development. So he emphasized that to be able to achieve this, rural development, self-reliance, education, equality, and national and nation building through a shared identity was the way to go. And in the sense of what Ujoma. So this was also where he saw that language what matters. So one reason and Tanzania became relatively successful in forging national unity was what in area promotion of what Kiswahili, one language as a unifying language across a highly diverse society. So you may think about it. Maybe countries adapting one language at a point in time may let them forget about the differences that exist with this language, that language. So he saw that and went with what one language and promoted one language to bring that kind of sense of unity. So you see that there's this strong sense that helps us to explain why Tanzania is often praised for a strong national cohesion than some other African countries or some other African country states. So Tanzania is also what also became that hub of Pan-African what solidarity, especially for liberation movement in what Southern Africa. So Tanzania under Nyerere is not just a case of socialist policy; it is also a case of what ethical leadership, which he was one of the leaders where out of power he handed power, and after that you could not find any huge amount of money in his account when other agencies checked and other state agencies of other Western countries did not find that on him. So that state building, that unity that he moved for Tanzania, and that continental commitment is what profoundly makes this leader one of a kind in terms of that idea that shapes to make us understand what some of the success in terms of having to have national unity could look like or have a sense of it be like. So this slide brings the earlier story to its first major crisis point. So what we've just spoken about, which is Africa at independence. We at independence. After when we started our independence, and then these leaders started building these industries I've spoken about when all these things were trying to be done and all those things. Now the issue over here is that immediate post-independent challenge. What were the challenge at what post-independent? When we get the independent, this is just doing. What were the challenges? The challenges were that fiscal constraints, balance of payment problem, political instability and coups, and then continued external dependency. So you see a map here that depicts in 2023 that depicts Africa's military coup over the period that shows governance that have been truncated, developmental projects that has been truncated, and things that were abandoned when coups happened. So basically, by 2022, we had experienced 214 coup attempts and had 106 as of 2023 succeed. That shows you the level of instability in some African countries that existed. And then the one on my right seeks to give you a sense of 10 African countries that were highly burdened in 2024. It seeks to tell you that some of these things that we wanted to do came at a cost. And some of these costs is what leaders had to deal with or grasp with. So what you realize that the early slides that showed us higher hopes, strong leadership, developmental visions, and ambitious state-led strategies. But these ambitions that I discussed with you ran into high constraints because the governments lacked revenue. Because remember we spoke about the fact that taxation was wide in some of what we discussed. So realize that government lacked enough revenue. They relied on unstable export earning. They relied on their cocoa, their coffee, and they were not determining the prices on the world market prices for the likes of the cocoa, coffee, the likes of the gold, the diamond. So because they're not determining the prices, when they hedge their economic decisions on that, and those prices plummet, it affects their revenue accumulation, and that is what we refer to or what we talk about. So as I said, the government lacked enough revenue. They relied on unstable export earning. They had to import machineries and expertise, and often borrowed heavily. So that was the issue of the financial constraint that we talk about. In terms of having talked about the balance of payment problem that emerged because countries were trying to modernize by importing equipment and then goods, while still depending on a narrow range of export. Because what happened over here is that these African countries were importing more into their country than they were exporting. But at the end, sometimes they were still exporting some of these commodities that they've not actually built a capacity for in their country. They were importing some of these equipments in their countries, and also doing importing more other stuffs in their country. And what they were exporting were actually not enough. So you realize that they were spending more money outside than inside their country. So it affected their balance of payment and it became a balance of payment problem for them. Also, political instability. Political instability flowed in many places because the institutions were weak, as we've said it multiple times. Expectations of the citizenry were high, where they were expecting at the end of the day they're going to go to school, they're going to get work to do, all things are going to change. And the states were the main route to wealth and power. So this made coup and one party rule and then militarization more likely in several cases. And Nkrumah was one unlucky person of coup d'etats in 1966. And the continued external dependency in the became a problem that even though they were trying, there was still this level of dependency externally, because the political independence that we got did not end dependency on foreign finance, because we were still borrowing, we were still dependent on some things. It didn't end foreign trade, it didn't end foreign technology, it didn't end foreign strategic influence on Africa, where some agencies were still having ways of influencing certain things done in Africa. So in a nutshell, or in other words, what I would say is that colonial rule may have ended formally, but unequal external relation offering persists in new forms. Actually, I'll in this particular conclusion, I'll be taking a hint from that of Young's and Willis thesis, and it's just to give us an argument and a summary of this. So, which they argue that the colonial state was embedded in post-colonial struggle. They inherited rather than what? Dismantled. They inherited rather than what? Dismantled. So this is a powerful conclusion because it helps us understand why so many early problems of governance, development, and legitimacy would persist after independence. So it gives us that summary in the three key points that says that, or that makes us ponder to understand that African states inherited authoritativeness or an authoritative or structure, extractive what economy, and artificial boundaries. So despite this high expectation, that when they did this, and they became to independent, there was this high expectation, early the what development, that people were also expecting that there's going to be that kind of development coming to spark everywhere. And there was this what early developmental what strategies that face what fiscal constraints, in the sense that money at the point, because we wanted to develop all right, but the money to do some of the things we wanted to do was not enough, because also know that the tax base was also what was narrow, or it was narrowed. An external dependency of still importing from the colonial what the colonizer. And one important thing is that an understanding that independence or independent condition is what essential for what analyzing contemporary African political economy. That if you want to understand this very well in terms of the contemporary African what political economy, you'd have to understand at independence what it was, what did they inherit, what did they do, what were the challenges, what were the expectations. And this is exactly what, right? Because if we do not understand the inherited state and the inherited economy, the leadership dilemma, and the development or ambitions of the independent period, then we will not understand the later history of what? Of coup, death, weak institution, uneven development, and the neo-colonial dependency that still persists. So the real conclusion I have for you here is that this lecture is not that independence failed. It is that independence was both a victory and a burden. It opened the door to freedom and dignity and African agency, but it also what exposed the deep damages that colonialism had done to political what structures, economic system, and social what capacity. The part one and two, when you check Kujifusu Inspire, you can kindly just search on YouTube Kujifusu Inspire. You're going to see the part one and two of this particular video, and then also appreciate the perspective and the trajectory of what we are discussing in terms of political introduction to political economy of Africa at independence. It gives you a better understanding of that. And also, these are some of the literature that you can acquaint yourself with and try to read through, and it will help you even get more perspective, more understanding, more examples about this particular part three, that what we spoke about, and this particular course as a whole. And then kindly you can reach out to Sewa Havens or Sewa Sleep Havens for your best curtains, bed sheets, duvet, and you can get delivery in Accra anywhere you find yourself. Just reach out to Sewa Havens by the phone numbers here and by WhatsApp. And you can also have pictures of all these things, and also what get to sleep comfortably and cover up in a nice way. Thank you very much. And then watch part 4 of our next topic.